Synagogue. Hello and welcome to Barnet Synagogue and EcoShabbat. My name is Samuel Landau and I am one half of the rabbinic team leading this remarkable community. This week we are marking a pivotal moment in the fight against climate change. The UK is currently hosting an event many believe to be the world's best last chance to get runaway climate change under control. And here in the United Synagogue, we are marking EcoShabbat as part of the EcoSynagogue initiative. COP26 is the 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference. For nearly 3 decades, the United Nations has been bringing together almost every country on Earth for global climate summits called COPs, standing for Conference of the Parties. In that time, climate change has moved from being a fringe issue to a global priority. And this year will be the 26th such annual summit, giving it the name COP26. And world leaders have already arrived in Scotland alongside tens of thousands of negotiators, government representatives, businesses, and citizens for 12 days of talks. And we already saw this week some of the agreements that were coming forth from those meetings and discussions. Most experts believe that COP26 has a unique urgency. To understand why, it's necessary to look back at another COP about 5 to 6 years ago. That was COP21, which took place in Paris in 2015. For the first time ever, something momentous happened. Every country agreed to work together to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees and aim for 1.5 degrees, to adapt to the impacts of a changing climate and to make money available to deliver on these aims. Thus, the Paris Agreement was born. And the parties that signed up to it agreed that every 5 years they would check in to see how they were doing. Unfortunately, the commitments laid out in Paris did not come close to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. And so the window for achieving this target is closing. Thus, we have this existential moment as the leaders of our countries and our economies have come together to attempt to combat this issue. I learned a new word or phrase this week in the context of COP26, and that phrase is virtue signaling. According to Wikipedia, virtue signaling is a pejorative neologism for the expression of a disingenuous moral viewpoint with the intent of communicating good character. In other words, virtue signaling may be thought of as a form of moral grandstanding in which a viewpoint or answer is calculated to look good, thereby making the object or speaker appear virtuous to others, rather than being chosen because it is strictly honest. So, for example, giving as one's opinion on a matter, an answer that is chosen for its ability to make the speaker appear good, or disingenuously expressing outrage, which suggests to bystanders that the speaker holds a moral high ground. In the context of COP26, certain naysayers are looking at the statements from all and wide, from synagogues to boardrooms, getting behind this moment and saying this might appear to be more like virtue signaling rather than a true expression of our virtuous approach in all aspects to the issue. Maybe that's too critical. In a more positive vein, a virtue signaler is, I suppose, a say-gooder, but not yet a do-gooder. I make a virtuous posture without fully backing it up with my actions. Aren't we all sort of guilty of that at times, of that mismatch between our stated virtue on the one hand and our manifest actions on the other? We see a tragic example of this in our Torah portion this week, Parashat Toledot. We read in the first part of this week's parasha that there are 2 different sons to Rebekah and Isaac, 2 children of different qualities and nature. As it says in the verse, Vayigdalu hana'arim, the boys grew up. Vehi Esav ish yedea tzayid ish sadeh. And Esau was a skilled hunter, a man of the field. V'Yaakov ish tam yoshev ohalim. Whilst Jacob was a man of integrity, a dweller in the tents of study. Despite this distinction, there was a special relationship that builds up between Esau, this hunter, this wild man, on the one hand, and his father, Isaac, on the other. And our sages talk about a split in Esau's existence between his head and his body. And perhaps this split is most interestingly expressed in a medrash, which talks about the funeral of Jacob. We find that actually Jacob and Esau were buried on the same day. Not only were they born on the same day as twins, they died on the same day as well. So the Medrash relates that when Jacob's funeral procession reached the cave of Machpelah, the tomb of the patriarchs in Hebron, the burial place beforehand already of Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, and Rebekah, they found Esau and his henchmen barring their path. Esau claimed that the sole remaining plot was his by inheritance after Jacob had already used up his plot to bury his wife Leah. When Jacob's children maintained that their father had bought out their brother's share, Esau denied this. The transaction had been put in writing, but the deed was back in Egypt. And fast-footed Naphtali, one of Jacob's sons, was dispatched to retrieve it. Naphtali is one of the tribes who was associated with the hind because he was the fast-moving brother. Nevertheless, Hushim, who was the deaf son of Dan, asked what the commotion was all about. What's the holdup? And was incensed to learn that Esau had halted the funeral of his revered grandfather. With a mighty blow of his sword, Hushim severed Esau's head, which rolled into the cave of Machpelah, into the tomb of the patriarchs, and came to rest in Isaac's lap, where it remains to this day. Thus it came to pass that Esau's head lies in the bosom of Isaac. Why does Esau's head get put into the cave with the other saints of history, with the patriarchs and the matriarchs, whereas his body is buried elsewhere? It's because there was a distinction in Esau's thinking from his action. Esau was actually held up by our sages as a prime example of someone who honored their parents. When Isaac wanted food, Esau served it to him. When Isaac needed something, Esau waited on him hand and foot. There was a respect that Esau could hold in his mind, a virtue that was true, but didn't quite filter through to all the rest of Esau's actions. Because, if you're really going to honor your father, if you're really going to live according to his legacy, then you will serve the one true God and you won't serve idols. If you really are interested in looking after your father, then you're going to be careful about how your family behaves within the extended camp. And again, that doesn't seem to happen with Esau's family. Yet, there is something clear. There is a virtue that he holds in his head, which isn't yet passed down to all his action. Perhaps Esau is one of the early virtue signalers of history. Now, psychologist and social commentator Jonathan Haidt, in his second book, The Righteous Mind, talks about two different sides to a person. Talks about the emotional side, which he labels the elephant, and the analytical, rational side, which he calls the rider. And he's considering behavior change. That often there's two parts of us. There's the blundering elephant going around. Maybe that would be our sort of instinctive actions. And then there's the rational rider trying desperately to guide the elephant, and maybe that's the mind. Haidt's analogy has it that the rider is rational and can therefore see a path ahead, while underneath him the elephant provides the power for the journey. However, the elephant is irrational and driven by emotion and instinct. If you're familiar with Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, you might call these System 1 and System 2. And Chip and Dan Heath have a superb book, Switch, How to Change Things When Change is Hard, where they build on this analogy of the elephant and the rider. They say, perched atop the elephant, the rider holds the reins and seems to be the leader. But the rider's control is precarious because the rider is so small relative to the elephant. Anytime the 6-ton elephant and the rider disagree about which direction to go, the rider is going to lose. He's completely overmatched. Perhaps Esau is a good example of where the rider has lost control of the elephant, where the instinctive Ish Sayyid, the man of the field, is the representation of the elephant, whereas that good head somehow loses control. However, there is another set of medrash which talks about a possible salvation for Esau, a possible way of reconnecting head to body, of reconnecting rational mind with emotional action. And here, Jacob is castigated. Why? Well, we know that there is a painful episode later on in the book of Genesis, the rape of Dinah, when Dinah goes out wandering and is found by Shechem and is raped. And the rabbis of the Medrash try to understand what mistake, what problem happened in Jacob's world to bring about this painful incident. So one tradition claims that Jacob was penalized for preventing Dinah from marrying his brother Esau. Before his encounter with Esau in a few parashios' time, Jacob sent his family across the Jabbok River, as we're told in Genesis chapter 32, that night he arose and he took his 2 wives, his 2 maidservants, and his 11 children. 11 children? There's a 12th. Who's the 12th? Where was Dinah? The Medrash answers that he had locked her in a chest, saying, so that Esau should not see her and take her from me. And so God says to Jacob, you withheld Dinah from your brother. And due to her good attributes, she could have reformed him. She could have reconnected head and body. She could have reconnected the virtue with action. Since you did not want to give her to Esau, who was circumcised, you are punished through her being taken by one who is uncircumcised. Since you did not give her in legitimate matrimony, therefore you are punished by her being taken by Shechem illegitimately. Imagine what could have happened. Imagine if Dinah had married Esau, had reformed him, and then possibly even the wish that Esau had to walk alongside his twin brother could have been fulfilled. That not only could there have been a direction of the rider with a motivated elephant, but the path of the two could be shaped together, walking in harmony, whereby virtuous belief is matched with righteous action. So Esau does not really only serve as the example of a virtue signaler. His brother Jacob serves as an example of what could have been. How we could have helped someone whose head was in the right place. We could have helped them put their actions in the same place as well. My friends, this is what it means to be a Jew. We are told we are an or lagoyim, a light unto the nations. A light not just both in the virtues we espouse and in the values we write and talk about, but in the actions that we take. That is what I think EcoShabbat should be the marker of. The marker of a group of communities coming together to say, not only to say, but to do the right thing. Everyone their little bit. May we continue to share that light with the world in the domain of COP26, in the domain of climate change, EcoSynagogues, supporting our world to manage this crisis and beyond. We turn to page 256 in the Chief Rabbi's Green Siddur, and we begin with Yedid Nefesh, those songs, that chant, that tune that brings in this hallowed day. Yedid Nefesh
Afarachaman Meshoich Avdecha Eretz Einecha Yarutz Avdecha Kemaya Yishtachavev El Mol Hadarecha Yeravno Yedidei Secha Minoi Fesav Echatam Adonai Ziv Hanam Nashechailas Avasecha Ana Elna Rafanana Veharesla No Yam Sivacha Post his chazek l'sis rapeh v'hayesana simcha saynam v'sik yemuna rachamecha v'chosana Abenahovecha ki zekama nichsafti leros b'seferes huzecha ele chamada libi v'chosana ve'atesanam hegalena ufros chavive yolai esukas shaloi mecha ta'eret mechvaydecha Nagila v'nismachabach Maherehav kiva maved v'chaneinu kimeyanam Yidirai la la la, yidirai la la la, yidirai la 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 la, yam bam bam bam. Yidirai la la la, yidirai la la la, yidirai la 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 la, yam bam bam bam. Yidirai la la la, yidirai la la la, yidirai la 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 la, yam bam bam bam. Yidirai la la la, yidirai la la la. Yidirai la 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 la. Da 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 la 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 yam bam bam bam
Page 258.
Lachun ranan aladoina nari alatzor yeshenu. Arba'im shana kodbado v'amaram to'e levavhem v'hem lo yedod arachai asher nishbati v'yapi im yavon emanochasi shir l'Adonai shir chadash. ישמחו השמיים וסוגר הארץ על ירם הים ליי יעלוי סודי ובכל אשר בו יעלי אז ירננו כל הציור לפני אדוני כי בא לשפוט הארץ ישפוט תבל ובצדק ואמן באמונה סיינה לה 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 ים דם 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 הללי 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 Ya la 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 la, la 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 la. Adonai malach tagel haaretz yismechu im rabim. Oh yafe Adonai sinura. Shomer nafshay chasida miyad rishayim yatzilem. Oh, zaru ala tzaddik kol yishleif simcha. Simchu tzadikim b'Adonai v'aydu lezecher kodshoy. Mizmor shir l'Adonai shir chadash. Yiram layah tevel yesheveva nehara simcha uchaf yachad harim yeranenu lifnei Adonai kiva lishpot haaretz yivish tevel betzedek V'amim b'meisharim Adonai malach yigazu amim Yoshev kurum tanataret B'amud anan yidaber aleihem Shamru edei som v'chol nasan namoy Adonai Eloheinu ata nisam Anaseh yisa lahem V'nai came ala liloisam Roi mamo Adonai Eloheinu V'ishtachavu lahar kodshoy Ki kadosh Adonai Eloheinu Mizmor David Kol Adonai yachil midbar, yachil Adonai mibakadesh. Kol Adonai cholel ayalois, v'hayeches ov yoros alalayov heichaloi. Koloi omer kavod alay Adonai, lama bo yashav yeshev Adonai. Melech le'olam Adonai, Ozei Amayiten Adonai Yevarech Esamo v'shalom. Ana b'choya k'drosim min chatat tzarura. We now turn to page 266. We're going to sing Lecha Dodi all together. As is the US TV custom, we're going to pause and not conclude the final Boi V'Shalom passage in order that we should not inadvertently bring in Shabbat before we've turned off our screens. Lecha Dodi, Lewe Kras Kada. Hawanei Shabbos ayayna kabbalah Lecha Dodi ala la la le Kraskano halalala Parnei Shabbos Ayana Kabbalat Halalala Shamor Vezachor B'dibor Echad Hishmianu Elam Yuchad Hadayna Yechad Uvoshma Yechad Shema Seferes V'Nisila Lama Chadaydi Alalale Kraskalo Halalala Parnei Shabbos Ayana Kabbalat Halalala Likras Shabbos L'chov Anelecha Ki Makor HaBaracha Mirosh Mikadem Nevesucha Sod Maaseh V'Machshav V'Tefila Leva V'Chadoi Di'alalala Le Kraskalo Halalala Parnei Shabbos Ayana Kabbalat Halalala Mikdash Melech Ir Malocha Kol Mitzay Mitoy Chafecha Rav Lach Sheves B'Yemek Habacha V'Yachamol Ola Yechemna Lewa Chadoi Di'alalala Le Kraskalo Halalala Parnei Shabbos Ayana Kabbalat Halalala His nari meyafar komi livshi bigdei sefate chami hal yad ben yishai beis alachmi korvaya nafshi geola lema v'chadoi di'alalala le kraskalo halalala Parnei Shabbos Ayana Kabbalat Halalala Hisoirari Kiva Oirech Komi Oiri Uri Yori Shir Daberi Kavoida Doinai Olayich Nigla Lama V'Chadoi Di'alalala Le Kraskalo Halalala Parnei Shabbos Ayana Kabbalat Yom Baladambam Lo Sevashi V'Leise Kalamim Aha Tishtoi O Matemi Yaladambam Baladambam Bach Yachesu Hani Yeyami V'Vanim Nesai Ratila L'Chadoi Kraskano Amalalam Reshabas Nekabla Hai L'Chadoi Kraskano Amalalam Reshabas Nekabla Yolim Shisa Shasayech Verachako Konavalayech Ayayayayayayayayay Ayasis Aldayech Elayayech Kim Seis Chosa Nakala Hay Lechadaydi Livik Raskala Yamadalam Leshabas Nekabna Hay Lechadaydi Livik Raskala Yamadalam Leshabas Nekabna Yaminus Mot Efraitzi Vesadoinai Taritzi Adyadish Ben Parzi Venismacha Nagila Hay Lechadaydi Le'mekras kala, yam baradam baradam baradam, teshavas nekabla, hay lechadaye, le'mekras kala. Hay da Bnei Shabbos nekabla.
Shabbat Shalom to everyone on US TV. A big Shabbat Shalom here from Barnet. From us to you. Shabbat Shalom, a good Chodesh. Lovely to see you.